Sometimes, for fun, I look up words in an etymological dictionary, look at their roots. I was surprised today. I looked up malevolent, and it means to wish ill on someone. And I figured the mal in malevolent, like the mal in malefic, like malo in Spanish, bueno y malo, good and bad. Malo means bad in Spanish. I just assumed that they would trace that back to mul in Sanskrit, which means dirt or impurity. But they didn't. They found a word in Avestan, which is an early Iranian language, and they found some words in Old Greek, and just a whole bunch of other languages. But somehow they missed mul. And I'm like 100% certain the etymologists, the people who study the linguistic roots of words, that they got it wrong. They just blew it. Like I'm certain of it. They posit PIE is a Proto-Indo-European language. It's an idea they have of a dead language that there is no existence of. The only existence of it can be traced out by looking at other old languages that are not connected to one another directly. Therefore, they must have another connection. And so they posit this Proto-Indo-European language because the IE family of languages, the Indo-European family of languages, has a number of features in common that works its way down into modern Romance languages like Italian and Spanish, but also into English through German. And so there's a precursor to Italian and German and Greek, and this language, this theoretical language that they have no actual proof of. There's no script. There's no people who spoke it that they're aware of. They call it PIE, Proto-Indo-European. There's plenty of Indo-European languages, Indo-Iranian languages as well, like Sanskrit and Avestan, but this Proto-Indo-European language is the source of all the Indic languages as well as the European languages, and it accounts for why you see commonalities in those languages. Does that make sense? And generally, Sanskrit is one of the earliest ones you'll find. So it's one of the earliest languages that you'll find listed in an etymology. You'll see Sanskrit as one of the earliest ones, and then they'll go to PIE. I have no problem with the idea that Sanskrit's not the oldest language in the world. It's like a fun party trick to break out on people, but I don't. I mean, there's really old stuff, like slavery is really old, and that doesn't make me think it's good. So there were terrible, foolish ideas that were commonplace a long time ago that we've realized are not good ideas about the nature of the world. If you could please turn off your phone, thank you. There's all sorts of terrible ideas that are really old. The law of the jungle is super old. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't replace that with some sort of social order, some kind of society. And so what was surprising to me was that they missed this. And I think I know the reason why they missed it. In Western thought, and I'm speaking very, very broadly about Western thought, really anything from the Middle East, anything, if you're looking at a map, anything this side, I guess there would be this direction for you guys. Anything this side of India. So you got India and China. I'm doing it in reverse from what I see. India and China. Anything this side of India and China. And India, of course, included modern-day Pakistan. It was part of the Sindhu-Saraswat civilization. It was only separated from India in 1947. And so anything that side of India, I'm just going to call that the West. That whole massive chunk of the world, it has some basic features. One of them is they assume dualism. They assume dualism, which means they assume there is good and evil in the world. That there's good and evil in the world, fundamental good and evil. Two basic, fundamental, irreducible qualities. So there's true evil. And if there's true evil, there's got to be a true hell and a Satan to go along with God in heaven. So just assuming theism for the sake of today's discussion, you've got radical dualism. And when I say radical dualism, I don't mean radical as a colloquialism, which means cool or subversive or amazing, but I mean a really strong, heavy dualism. Radical dualism. Fundamental dualism. That there's fundamentally two forces in existence, namely good and evil. And evil is defined by words like malice and malevolent and malefic, all that use this mal prefix. All that use this mal prefix, from malus, Latin, and where you get malo from in Spanish. And so it's pretty easy where those words come from. Malfeasance. There's all sorts of words that start with this root. But when you describe evil, you use words like malicious, malevolent, to indicate a fundamental illness, a fundamental badness, a fundamental evilness, a fundamental sadistic, malefic, hateful energy. Think about it. We might use the word evil in a very colloquial or a kind of a modern parlance type way. But if you think about evil as a philosophical concept, it's diametrically and fundamentally opposed to good. You guys follow this? And then that creates some pretty big philosophical problems if you believe in God. The first problem is pretty easy to spot. I'm guessing some of you have spotted it if you have a bit of training or you've just done some thinking. What's the huge problem with evil if you believe in God? Yeah?
Fundamental evil requires a source, and without God, sucks.
Fundamental evil requires a source, and for that to be God sucks. Does not get you a passing grade because you flubbed it on sucks. That's nothing like any kind of an explanation. Let me help you, and then try to remember it for next time. Generally speaking, God is defined by most peoples as a source of everything. Therefore, if evil existed, evil would also find its source in God, and now God would be dystheistic. It would be no longer an omnibenevolent God, an all-good God. In fact, God would have to have evil as one of his constituent basic elements because it exists as a basic element of reality, completely and diametrically opposed to good, and it comes from God, who is the source of everything. If you see God as the source of everything, then he also has to be the source of evil. Did you follow that? And if he's the source of evil, he's no longer all good. Alternatively, he could be not all powerful, and that evil exists as a force beyond God, which then would, also be pretty problematic. If God's not all good or not all powerful, you're not really dealing with a serious conception of God. At best, you're dealing with a God that's competing with other gods in some kind of paranormal, I don't know, like a comic book superhero kind of world, where deities can be killed and they can be overcome by other deities and they're subject to base qualities. Really what you get from most polytheistic worldviews. Most polytheistic deities are very, very similar to comic book superheroes. They've got some real base qualities. Like a classic example of this is Spider-Man, who's a super nerd, the first nerdy cartoon character, super nerd. I guess Clark Kent was a precursor, but Spider-Man was even more gangly and immature and so on and so forth. Superman was quite the stoic, if you look at him and Lois Lane and their dealings. I can't remember who Spider-Man's counterpart was, his significant other was. Mary Jane. Also synonym for marijuana, so that may or may not be accidental, I don't know. It was a standard euphemism for marijuana when Spider-Man was created. So, but he was, he was gangly and he was a teenager and zit-faced teenage kid who had all those qualities of being awkward and uncoordinated and so on and so forth. But yeah, if you look at most polytheistic traditions, that's how they conceive of their deities. They're lusty, angry, and greedy, always bickering, just on a really large stage. Those don't really qualify as God, as a source of everything, as an omnipotent source of everything, as an all-powerful source of everything. And so when you get into a really serious definition of God, then the existence of evil becomes a problem if it comes from that God. You got it now? He's got to work it out. Okay. Yeah, that's just prima facie. There's other ones, but that's kind of an insuperable problem with a fundamental conception of evil. You really need a fundamental competitor to God, or God becomes Satan. You have to call him God/Satan, or you need a God and a Satan. And in fact, God's not more powerful than Satan. He's, equally powerful. And maybe if you look at the state of the world, maybe Satan's even got the edge on him. And so you got, the devil on one shoulder and God on the other, and they're whispering into your ear and fighting over your fate. It's a fairly impoverished notion of divinity, and really, you're almost like you're rooting for God. Like I believe in you, like you can do it, like the little train that could, as opposed to, I have faith in you and I'm being held in your hand and I'm protected by you, and you are, the creator, King of kings, Lord of lords, God of gods, the zenith, the apex. That kind of faith, that kind of grace requires an omnipotent, omnibenevolent deity. And Satan, just fundamental evil, just doesn't work with it. It's actually just an unworkable philosophy. Honestly, Christianity just breaks down philosophically at this point. God created the devil. Okay, that's, he created Lucifer. Lucifer fell. That's okay. You got free will. You chose to fall. But then for Lucifer to become the Lord of souls in this world and King of hell, and a place which is truly absent of God, which God could never intervene in, and the doors of hell are locked forever, and you go there forever and there's no coming back. And that stuff just does not work. It doesn't work. Hell would have to be totally permeable. You'd have to get, a mulligan, a do-over. you'd have to get you'd have to be able to get out of hell for good behavior, early parole. There'd have to be clemency. There'd have to be just basically the same way any functioning society works. God can't be less munificent and open to redemption than an average functional society in the modern age. And so the same way we have clemency and parole and time off for good behavior and the possibility of redemption, and we even call penitentiaries because you become penitent when you're there and you can grow and you become edified. Your cosmos would have to have those features as well. God would have to be more moral and good than your average collection of human beings when they sit down and write a decent system of law. Do you guys follow that? The pervading, and when I say pervading, I mean 99.x% of Christians believe in a fundamental hell. At least theologically. Maybe if you get them on the street, you might come up with a different, if you do a Gallup poll and ask, you might come up with a different number. Like if you look at Sharia, which is, Islam. Islam, the first day of the Islamic calendar was the day that Muhammad conquered Medina and established Sharia. Sharia is a lifestyle. It's not a philosophical worldview. It's a theocratic worldview for governing society. In fact, a place becomes Dar al-Salam, a house of peace. A country becomes peaceful in the Islamic world, theologically, when Sharia is enforced, irrespective of whether the population is Islamic or not. You can have a majority of the population being another religion, but if they're forced to follow Sharia, then that's called Dar al-Salam versus Dar al-Harb, a house of war, which is any country where Sharia is not enforced. This is why, democratic countries that, like Indonesia or Turkey, the entire population is, practically speaking, Muslims, but they have a secular system of government. They're a problem for fundamentalist Muslims because they go against the Quran, that you must establish Sharia. And the first day of the Islamic calendar wasn't the day that Muhammad was born, or the day he had his first visitation from Allah. It's rather the first day he established Sharia law in Medina and forced the entire populace to follow it. So if you poll Muslims nowadays, the last one I read was in 2014, about 550, 600 million Muslims will say Sharia law should be enforced all over the world. Roughly a third of the Islamic population, which is 1.5 to 2 billion people. But officially it's their doctrine. It just may be that not everybody follows that anymore. Does that make sense? So maybe you get a different poll if you ask Christians, how many of you really believe in eternal hell? Just like many Catholics believe in abortion, although official church doctrine of the Vatican is that abortion is profane and illegal and immoral. But at least philosophically speaking, theologically speaking, 99.x% of Christians believe in eternal hell, which is totally unworkable with an all-good and all-powerful God for the reasons I mentioned. That's fundamental evil. Fundamental dualism. And pretty much, like I said, everything this side of India assumed that. In India, you get this really strong idea that everything came from God, and it gets worked out into a coherent philosophy. Part of which is that you can't have an eternal hell. No one's beyond redemption. Everybody's always got a shot. And in fact, they have a different theory of self. The basic theory of self as expressed in the Christian worldview is Augustinian, theodicy. Adam and Eve went south, and because of that, everybody who came from them is fundamentally fractured. You could call the theology a fractured soul theology. We're fundamentally broken. Rakta, You want to make sure that guy's okay?
Yeah.
You sure? Huh? Looks a little big for Muddy. Is he good? Huh?
Everything's fine.
You sure? All right. I'm a bit of a dualist. When I see people, I automatically think, who's that guy? Just poke his head and make sure we're safe. Functionally, a dualist. Anyway. Yeah, it's a fractured soul theology. You are broken. You are invested with immortal sin, a fundamental wrongness because of the mistakes of Adam and Eve. You inherited their bad qualities. This goes against, any, like I said, any reasonable society nowadays where you're not judged by some kind of a really hard caste system that you can never evolve beyond your parents. But, here Adam and Eve messed up way back when at the dawn of creation, and their great times a couple of hundred grandchildren, if you're a young age creationist, assuming 6,000 years, 25 years to a generation, so 4 to a century, 6,060 centuries, 240 generations, or a lot more, whatever you want to do. You're broken because they're broken. They messed you up. They chose wrong. They ate the forbidden fruit. Listen to the serpent. Listen to Satan. And now everybody's invested with immortal sin. And by the vicarious atonement of another, that's Jesus, you can know redemption. But you on your own have no capacity to redeem yourself. You are forever destined to go down. No hope for you, except for through another. You're so disempowered, there's no chance. You have no direct connection to God. You have no ability to redeem yourself. You have no fundamental faculties that would allow you to turn back towards divinity. You're broken for all time, except for this superhero-like figure, a Silver Surfer-like figure, if you want to think of the appropriate superhero that's like a Christ-like figure. And so the Silver Surfer comes in and bleeds for you. What does that say about God? That he needs blood. He needs a blood sacrifice. He couldn't just let you off the hook. Jesus couldn't pray on your behalf or set a good example for you or give a teaching. He had to be crucified. God needed to satisfy his bloodlust. And only through the blood of Christ was the sins of man washed away. Interestingly, the Pope said recently that all souls, Christians and Muslims, were redeemed by Christ. And everybody started freaking out. That, wow, look at this Pope. This Pope's amazing. He likes gay people, and he's washing the feet of Muslims and women, and he's nice to children, and not in a weird way. And this is my Pope. Until theologians pointed out that redemption is different than salvation. And the act of being crucified redeemed all souls. And that's been Christian theology for 2,000 years. At least for 1,800, 1,700 years. And so he wasn't really saying everybody's going back to heaven. He was just saying that God gave you a shot if you accept Jesus. Redemption and salvation are two different concepts in Catholic theology. So he said it, and everyone's like, ooh, that's cool, except for people who actually knew Catholic theology, and they're like, whoa, we've been saying this for 1,700 years. He's just saying standard church dogma, nothing special. What a horribly disempowering worldview. Imagine if you were a child psychologist, and you were trying to figure out what was wrong with a kid, and so you did what you do with children. You ask them to play with dolls, and you watch them. Clandestinely, which actually seems kind of wrong, but anyway, that's what you do. You watch a kid play with toys, and you watch them clandestinely and make notes, figure them out. And they were playing with 2 dolls, and the kid was holding the 2 dolls in their hand, and they were talking, conducting a dialogue between the 2 dolls that you were watching. And they said, one doll said to the other, "You're broken. You're no good. You're fundamentally broken. You're evil. You're going to go to hell and burn like a fire. You can't help yourself. You're hopeless. Your situation is dire. Your soul is fundamentally fractured, invested with mortal sin. Except for there is a figure external to yourself, and you're wholly dependent on them, and only they can save you. What would you think about that kid's parents? You'd think they were good Protestants. They instilled their kid with some real serious issues from a young age. Incredible codependence, right? And just utterly disempowered. What to speak of horrible self-esteem. It's that's the core of it all. You have this awful self-esteem that you're fundamentally a bad person. Everybody. Not only you, it's a horrible view of the world as well. A terrible view of self, that you're fundamentally bad, and a terrible view of the world, that everybody else is fundamentally bad too. Our tradition has an answer to this. And that's that there's no such thing as evil. There is no word in Sanskrit for evil. Just wrap your head around that. There is no word in Sanskrit for evil. Because the entire culture does not believe in such a concept of fundamental evil. Fundamental malevolence, fundamental sadism, fundamental maleficness, fundamental malice. They don't believe in it. Consequently, they don't believe any soul is fundamentally broken. They have what's called a pure soul theology. And the worst that can happen is you can become ignorant, which is likened to dirt. And dirt is a great metaphor for ignorance. It's a great synonym for ignorance, because dirt can be washed off. And so mala, which means impurity or dirt, which is the root of all those words, got missed by the etymologists because it did not mix with their idea of fundamental evil, because it just means dirt. So they borrowed the term, didn't give credit, super low class. Especially today. Right? It's cultural appropriation. Right? Super inappropriate, bad marks for the etymologists. Really bad marks. And they ignore the oldest term for this concept that's in existence, that we have record of. They borrowed the word. It's just a massive cultural appropriation. What is it? The Civil Liberties Association, United Civil Liberties, ACLU. Thank you. American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU. We could call them up. This is really bad. So yeah, I looked at the etymological dictionary and I saw this, and I saw this huge oversight, and I thought about why it would have occurred, and it must have occurred because the term mul in Sanskrit does not match up with the worldview of fundamental evil, because it merely means dirt. It gets you to the same place. It can account for rape and murder and all sorts of terrible stuff that goes on in the world under the name of evil with a lowercase e. It just doesn't qualify for evil with a capital E, because it's not fundamental to the soul. Just like water can be made sewage and thereby made unpotable, undrinkable. But water on a molecular level never gets made undrinkable, and so you can distill it either through the sunshine and the water cycle or through a steam distillation process, and you can cook out. You can cook out all the dirt, and that water can be made potable again, as it is on a destroyer, on a ship, where they have to, they can't just take on water all the time, so they have to find these, really good systems of purifying the water that people are drinking. Interestingly, the Sanskrit word for cooking is the Sanskrit root is tap, which becomes tapasya, or austerity, which is a means of purifying yourself by cooking, like you would cook gold, and then the alloys that might have been joined to gold will cook off, and you'll be left with this pure yellow substance. Pure 24 karat gold is extremely yellow. If you know gold, you just look at it, you're like, oh, that's 18, that's 14. It just has this shiny, silverish look. It doesn't really look like gold. Real gold is this incredibly beautiful yellow color. 22 karat is almost that color, but once you get down to 18, it starts to look a little silvery. 14 even more so. Gold plating even more so. The word for purifying is the same word as heating, because just like you heat up water and you purify, similar, you can also heat yourself up and you can burn off some of that negativity because it's not intrinsic to you, because it's not fundamental to you, because it's not ontologically basic. It's not who you are. You aren't fundamentally broken. You aren't fundamentally bad. Even Hitler? Even Hitler. Even Genghis Khan? Even Genghis Khan. Which is the proper pronunciation, by the way. You get it? And so it's a serious shift. There couldn't be a hell. No one's destined to go there forever. Maybe there could be a down, like place where you go for a time out. Maybe hell with a lowercase h, but no capital H hell. No capital D devil. No capital E evil. Just various degrees of ignorance and dirt that can be washed off therapeutically. That was a tangent that I just decided to go with when I sat down. My actual class, which I'm going to try to do real quick now, because I had some other stuff I wanted to talk about, which I think is interesting. I at least want to touch on it. Is that the Krishna regularly speaks in the Gita. He says things like jnanam atmani vindati. You'll find knowledge within yourself, which of course is based on this pure soul theology, that you have knowledge within yourself. It's waiting to be uncovered once you get out of the way. It's not extrinsic to yourself. It's not through another. But he also says statements like Dadami buddhi yogam tama, I'll give you that wisdom, that buddhi, which is what makes Buddha, his enlightenment, his wisdom. Buddhi means wisdom in Sanskrit. And discernment, wisdom, intelligence, there's a bunch of different words that would be good synonyms depending on the context. And so there's this idea that wisdom and knowledge are given by God, and also that they're naturally occurring within you. And that's actually a radical idea. That the kingdom of God is within. That wisdom is within you. Calvin, in another, hypocritical feature of his tradition, believed in a sensus divinatus, which means a divine intuition or divine sense. Of course, you have a divine sense. How come it's not going to be enough to get you back to God? How come you need Jesus and you have a mortal sin if you have this sensus divinatus? You follow? That divinity is within you. So it's unworkable. And he didn't use it. He used it to try to say, I don't have to give a good cogent evidence for God's existence. Instead of having to logically do what everybody else has to do and present a reasonable case for God's existence, I can just say I have a sensus divinatus that God exists. That was what he was attempting to do. Calvin, who's a very, very primary Protestant theologian. I think it's a terrible argument. Because if I say I have a sensus divinatus that proves to me God exists, I don't have to give a good argument for it. You can then say to me, right, and it proves to me God does not exist. I have a sensus divinatus, and it proves to me that God does not exist. And then we're back to square one, and I haven't gone anywhere. As soon as if your argument can just be co-opted by the other party and used against you, you've got a bad argument on your hands. But yeah, there's this radical idea that the kingdom of God is within, that you have knowledge within you, that if you turn inwards, that if you quiet your mind, it'll awaken and you'll have access to it. And you have an innate connection with divinity that you can experience if you tidy yourself up. This gets back to what I want to talk about today, which was a lot of times when we're told to follow rules, we're told to follow rules just because if you follow the rules, you'll go to heaven, and if you don't follow the rules, you'll go to hell. And it becomes a crime and punishment sort of deal. And you're told, these things are good and these things are bad, and there's no necessary even logic behind them. You're just told, these are the good things, these are the bad things. If you do these good things will happen. If you do bad things will happen. And in a lot of ways, that's a religion. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not this and that and the other. There's cognitive ones like coveting. Most of them, the other 9 are action-based. So there's a cognitive behavioral model with bad thoughts and bad deeds, and pretty much you just get a list. And you get this in other traditions as well. Your yamas and your niyamas, just get these lists. Like, these are what things you have to do, and these are the things you don't do. Sometimes they'll get a little sophisticated. Like Jesus said, love God with your heart and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the only 2 commandments. My father had 10, I only have 2, so he tried to distill it down to the essence. And love is cool because it can be used both as a verb as well as a noun, so it can be a feeling as well as an action. So he still kept that cognitive behavioral model, and it was about how you feel towards God and how you feel towards the rest of the world. It's pretty comprehensive. Follows the me-see principle, mutually exclusive and comprehensively exhaustive. It gives you a real world view. It's good stuff. But you end up with just this list of rules. And Indic spirituality, I think, is a little bit more pragmatic and logical in this regard. There may be other ways in which Indian spirituality is deficient and Christianity supersedes it. No problem. Islam is better than Hinduism in certain regards. No problem. I'm totally fine with stipulating to that. But in this specific regard, I think we have a more logical and coherent system. And here's why. Rather than just saying, this is good and this is evil, and you do this and good things will happen, you do this and bad things will happen, you get a little bit more engagement with our philosophical tradition. And they make several points. And they're not easy points to make. I want to try to make them quickly. They're not super easy points to make, but they're relatively easy. I'm going to give it my best, see how I do. On one hand, if you are materialistic, and if you're addicted, let's say, for instance, to sex or drugs, your addiction to those items makes you a victim of your senses and stops you from becoming peaceful and thoughtful. And it animalizes you. It makes you a 2-legged animal in the sense that your appetites control you and you become controlled by your urges. And you begin to lack the humanity which allows you to exercise impulse control, to think about things deeply. And therefore, if you want to think deeply about God, your place in the cosmos, and higher things like that, you simply have to give up materialism, not because it's evil per se, or it's taking you to hell, but because it eats up too much of your energy and makes it impossible for you to think dispassionately about the nature of your existential condition and your relationship with divinity. Just like if you're binging on, like they took soldiers. This is back in the 60s when you get away with this without getting in serious trouble. They took a bunch of soldiers up into an airplane and they had them doing math in the airplane. And then they had one of the engines blow up. They set a explosive on the engine that made the engine smoke. They said, oh, we lost one of our engines. And the pilot started going like this, like turning side to side, indicating that the plane had lost one of its engines and that it had malfunctioned. They did another one where they put people out and they said there's going to be, munitions exercises going on a few miles away, but we're just going to do our little exercise here. And then all of a sudden, like, trees started blowing up all around the soldiers, and because they set them to blow up, and they had them fixing radios, so they could call off the munitions, which were, the ordnance, which was, going off course and going to blow all of them up. And then they saw how fast they could fix radios and how well they could do math in these really, really, heightened emotional states. And they found, of course, that people did terrible at math and terrible at exercise like putting radios together. So if you're in this heightened state of arousal because of addiction and the monstrous effect it has on your dopamine levels and your serotonin levels, as well as prolactin, oxytocin, all the neurotransmitters, and how much it just rips your head apart. How would you be able to think deeply about God and your relationship with God and dispassionately consider your existential situation? How would it be possible? And so entirely separate from this, this is good and this is evil, there's just simply the reality that if you want to deeply think about the nature of your existence, you have to be peaceful and quiet. That's one argument. And I think it's a good argument. It takes a little effort to make, but I think it's a really solid argument. And it gets you beyond this he said, she said type situation where God's just dictating to you what you have to do with no rhyme or reason and becomes just a bad version of divine command theory where you're just being told what to do as an ethical theory. God told me to. Because what if God starts telling you all sorts of terrible stuff? The other argument, which is related to the first one, but I think it deserves a little bit of exploration as as an extra element or an extra limb or an extra way of arguing for it. Is that some things are fundamentally more divine in this world. And that what goes by the name of evil or selfishness is really weakness and an inability to do the right thing. And that if you are capable of doing the right thing, you will. It's not that you just choose left or right, but rather goodness is the default position and evil or badness is the inability to accomplish goodness. And God, of course, being omnipotent, would never be prohibited from accomplishing what was right, and therefore he would be all good as an element of being all powerful, just like he would be all knowing as an element of being all powerful, because knowledge is a power, and therefore if God was all powerful, he would also be all knowing. And having created the cosmos, he'd be the most powerful force in the cosmos. Just like in a singularity, that singularity possesses all the features of the manifest universe within itself. And now, goodness becomes divine, more divine. And therefore, if you want to get close to Krishna, you got to do goodness. And then you can start to work out what does good look like. Selflessness. You can start to look at the best features, what makes human beings thrive. And you can start to see those best features, those would be divine. You have to extrapolate from your own experience. Because we're looking at this world and we're trying to build to that world, so we have to start with what's in front of us. Just like when you say all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore he's mortal. It's a deductive argument. It's a deductive logical syllogism. But it's built on inference. I looked, I saw you died, my mother died, my father died, everybody's dying, and therefore I can eventually conclude that all men are mortal, unless you show me an immortal person. So all good deduction is built on inference. All philosophy begins with inference. You look in front of you, you see what's in the world, and you start to build from that a worldview. That's, by the way, why we say cause and effect in English. They say effect, cause in Sanskrit. Sat, asat. Effect, cause. Because you always look at the effects first and then work your way back to the cause. And to say cause and effect means you're just skipping a step, which is where you have to start with the effect, work your way back to the cause, and then you can assuredly know what the effect's going to be in the future. because you've started with inference, with observation. So if you want to figure out, why is selflessness and cooperation and considerateness and kindness, why are they divine? You got to look at what are the best features of human society, what differentiates us from all other species, and what allows human society to thrive. And you'll find that these qualities are the qualities that are espoused by, at least in an ideal form, by all societies. If you go with the opposite, the law of the jungle, you don't have a society. It all begins with, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equally and are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, such as the right to life, liberty, and to happiness. You have to start with stuff like that in any tradition and then build from that what a legal system would look like. So either A, in a pragmatic way, if you want to think about God, you got to stop thinking about matter. Forget good and evil. It's just practical. You want to investigate spirituality, you got to quiet your mind. And therefore you got to behave piously. Not because pious is pious, but simply because, it's actually where you get the word pity from, by the way, but because it frees you up to think about higher things. Alternatively, you can argue that that goodness is a derivative feature of power, and that evil is an inability to do the right thing, not because you chose to zig instead of zag, but because you don't possess the strength to do the right thing, and therefore an all-powerful being would be all good, just as he would be all-knowing, because knowledge is also power, and therefore as you become more in tune with that divine being, or if you want to be, you'll naturally also be good. And then what does that good look like? You look for the best features of human society, and you make an argument that those most redeeming and most perennial features of a good society are in fact divine-esque qualities that lead you closer to divinity, and that's a way of escaping the he said, she said, arbitrary nature of most lists of rules. Do this, don't do this. In this way, you can make an argument why you should stop sleeping around, why you should stop using drugs and alcohol, why you should be vegan and not eat animals and cause pain unnecessarily to another living entity for no good reason. Why you should eat lower on the food chain and therefore eat plants instead of animals, because it's the least amount of pain, even though you might still be causing some pain, because plants lack a central nervous system. They don't have the same C neuron fibers that human beings do, and so same nociceptors, and they don't experience pain the same way we do, although animals do. Fish suffer. They injected fish with acid, and the fish moved around super uncomfortably, and then they filled the tank with lidocaine and allowed the fish to choose which tank they wanted to go into, and the fish swam towards the lidocaine tank because it would minimize their suffering. Even fish. What to speak of land animals, the ones that people traditionally eat. So you're causing pain. And of course, you're just taking away that entity's right to live. It's like, forget equal rights for animals. Nobody's asking you to give equal rights to animals. At least give them the right to live. Stop eating their carcasses. We kill 50 billion land animals a year. 1 to 3 trillion fish. It's like a Holocaust. And they suffer just like we do. Go take a knife to your dog. They bleed just like you. They'll run away. They'll yelp. They'll nurse their wound. They get traumatized. And you can start to build a really coherent argument for our lifestyle. It's not just based on our sacred text says it, which leaves us open to somebody else quoting their sacred text, but actually fleshes out why we believe what we believe. And so I thought Indic spirituality really has something to contribute with a pure soul theory, with ignorance instead of evil, with dirt instead of evil that somehow got missed, with the word malevolence. What a crime. They just couldn't see it because it didn't have the same dualistic worldview where the word meant evil. and with ideas about commandments and rules and regulations and how you should live your life, and not just simply saying, well, you're supposed to, or you're going to go to hell if you don't, or it's evil, or it's wrong, but actually making an ethical argument for our lifestyle. You know, a coherent ethical argument, a persuasive ethical argument, an ethical argument that stands up to scrutiny and doesn't just become because I said so. That's it. That's what I got for you guys today. Feedback? Yeah.
Thank you for the class. Pure soul theory is just so, once you hear it, it's just so convincing. I just struggle to understand.
If I was a Christian and I heard of pure soul theory, I would immediately go back to the biblical tradition and I would find that pure soul theory somewhere in the annals of my tradition, so I could say, hey, I'm still a Christian and I believe this. And I would just divorce myself from all the corrupt soul theories, because they just sound so unhealthy, even from a psychological perspective. They're so unworkable. They're abusive, actually. It's like an incredibly abusive theology. Somehow or other, you can't get away with treating your kids like this. You get arrested for criminal neglect or something like that, for some sort of emotional abuse. But somehow if you write it in an old book, now it becomes a worldview and you're untouchable. Because it's like, this is our religion. I remember there's a group called the Religion of Drugs. And he made an argument that, drugs were a sacrament in his religion, and therefore he should be exempt from all U.S. laws pertaining to drug use, because religious freedom would mean that he was allowed to do what he wanted to. And so, I don't know why I tangented to that. It was connected to what I was saying, and I just completely forgot. I got lost in my tangent. If I was a Christian, I would immediately want to go back and do this and reject the rest of the tradition. How'd I get to... Anyway, we'll let it go there. More? Yeah.
I really like how you put the explanation for why we follow our rules and regulations. It's very easy to fall into the trap, just do it because it says so in the book.
And you do it, it says so in the book, works when you're preaching to the choir. But if you're trying to talk to somebody outside of your groupthink, then you're just susceptible to somebody going, why? And then you look like a fool because you can't answer. And that's a problem. Because it really means you don't have good reasons for why you're doing what you're doing. You're just a blind follower. And now the only people you can minister to and help are other blind followers. And you got a problem. You're actually helping make the world more fanatic. Now I remember. I was doing two things at once. I was talking, but I was thinking of my other thing as well. It's almost like if you say this is my religion, you can get away with just the worst ideas in the world and no one can call you out on them. You go, it's my religion. Oh, drugs are my religion. I can do whatever I want. I'm untouchable. So it's almost like, that's my religion. So I have this awful worldview of a fractured soul. It just doesn't work at all. But it's in my sacred text, so I'm exempt. Nobody can critique me. Anything else? Tomorrow, we'll tell you later. Let's do a little kirtan. Thank you very much.